I'm very pleased that you are all with us today at the first event of our digital theme week, Capitalism and Sustainability, and I hope that you are all doing very well. It's a pleasure for me to give you a short introduction into the central topic of the theme week and, in particular, to introduce you to our keynote speaker today, Jason Moore, to whom I'm sending our best wishes here from Hamburg across the Atlantic Ocean to the state of New York. Now, what is at stake with capitalism and sustainability? The last decades have taught us that exposure to ecological catastrophes is inherently linked to the logic of capitalist wealth distribution. One important source of our ecological crisis lies in the paradox of wealth in capitalist society, which expands individual riches at the expense of public wealth, including the wealth of nature. Therefore, humanity in the 21st century is facing what might be described as its ultimate ecological challenge, the destruction of the climate that has nurtured human civilization and with it the basis of life on Earth as we know it. Most ecosystems on the planet are now in decline. Enormous ruptures have been driven through the sensitive structure of the Earth system. The economy and the Earth are heading for a fateful collision unless we change course. But more than 40 years after the first World Climate Conference held by the United Nations, it seems that capitalism is more likely to collapse than to be changed in a sustainable way. But what exactly is wrong with capitalism, and why does capitalism has such destructive effects on the ecosystem? I think throughout the long history of the critique of capitalism, mainly three answers have been given to that question. At its beginning, nature and the ecosystem hardly didn't matter. Capitalism was mainly understood as an economic system whose defining components are private property, market exchange, wage labor, commodity production, credit and finance, profit and rent, all elements denominated in money and grounded in the exploitation of the working class. Capitalism was criticized for its injustice. The most important theoretical source of this kind of critique, of course, was Marx's critique of political economy. A second type of critic of capitalism objects not only to economic exploitation, but to the destructive effects that capitalism has on society as a whole. This perspective was outlined, for instance, in Karl Polanyi's theory of the Great Transformation. According to his view, the so-called satanic mill of the market, as Polanyi put it, the satanic mill of the market permanently undermines the non-economic preconditions that make capitalism possible in the first place. Labor, land, and money are treated like any other goods, transformed in fictitious commodities, which ends up in them being damaged both in their substance and in their social function. Capitalism was criticized for the marketization of the whole social world and nature. Now, a third type of critique of capitalism places social relations to nature at its very center. This kind of critique can certainly be tied to the writings of Marx. According to Marx, capital treats nature as a source of free or very cheap gifts to which it helps itself, but fails to restore or to repair it. Also, later approaches to Western Marxism understood the degradation of nature as the core of societal domination, as, for instance, the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory argued in its Critique of Instrumental Reason. It is from these different sources that an eco-Marxist critique of capitalism has emerged, which has gained great intellectual influence today. Our keynote speaker today is the leading scholar in this worldwide discourse. In particular, Jason Moore's theoretical approach has the merit of reframing our understanding of the conflict between capitalism and the ecosystem in a far-reaching way. In his view, capitalism as a system of endless capital accumulation requires not only a constant search for new low-cost nature, including human nature. In doing so, capitalism in its long history of 500 years permeated nature itself and created its own web of life. We are thus dealing with a twofold movement in one. Capitalism works through nature, and at the same time, nature is being produced by capitalism. In other words, capitalism is not only an economic system, nor just an institutionalized social order. It is something more, a very special mode of organizing nature with multiple destructive consequences. In this way, Jason Moore also gains a new synthesis of the old dualism of nature and society, not by ontological speculations, but a historical investigation of the emergence of a capitalist world ecology. With this theory, Jason Moore has become has become an extremely important voice in the critique of capitalism that is being heard all over the world. Affiliated as an environmental historian and professor of sociology at Binghamton University in the US, his books and essays on environmental history, on capitalism and social theory have been widely recognized. From its extensive oeuvre, I just want to mention two books that have been extraordinarily successful also in their German translation. Capitalism in the Web of Life from 2015, and together with Raj Patel, A History of the World in Seven Cheap Things from 2017. We are really excited to have Jason Moore with us today as our keynote speaker, and we are now very much looking forward to his lecture on the topic sustainability, spaceships and slaveships, climates of class politics, and the capitalist world economy 1492 to 2030. Jason, again, a warm welcome from the whole Humanity Center here in Hamburg. And now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Neckel. This is a fantastic and very generous introduction, and an extremely in fact, one of the best concise summaries of the history of Marxism, ecology, the critique of capitalism that I've heard. Such a beautiful and insightful summary. So it's my pleasure to be here today. It's a great honor, and I want us to think about the present conjuncture of the end of the Holocene, which is a long era of more or less 11,000 years of unusual climate stability. That's now ending. I want us to remember also that the Holocene itself, this very, very long interglacial period, is unusual because of how long it's lasted, and that the reason underpinning that was in fact the birth of class society and settled agriculture between 6,000 and 7,000 years ago. The class society, it seems, was itself a kind of Archimedean lever towards carbonizing the atmosphere, which for millennia made this biosphere much more warmer, much more favorable to settled agriculture. And it's worth reflecting on that dialectic, that the class society that created the conditions for the favorable climate of the Holocene is now the class society today is unraveling that Holocene, as we'll see. So we know that we are at the end of, in geological terms, in a climatological sense, we are at the end of a very long period of history. What comes next is very open. Of course, we have all heard the Anthropocene, the age of man, and the idea that humans did it. I'll come back to this later in the lecture, but one of the themes that I want to foreground is at the heart of sustainability as a political project since the early 1970s, we have seen a kind of anti-politics politics that says humans are driving planetary change. Now, if you're a geologist, that's entirely acceptable. If you are dealing with human affairs, that's entirely unacceptable because humans are not a collective geohistorical actor. And attempts to make humanity a collective geohistorical actor have always been made by bourgeois naturalists going back to Malthus and even earlier in order to naturalize bourgeois relations of power and class inequality. So what is it that we are saying hello to, if not the Anthropocene? Well, we don't know. Maybe a capitalocene hellscape, maybe something more just, equitable, and in a lowercase sense of the term, more sustainable. So we need to begin, and this point that Professor Neckel made about not being merely speculative is hugely important. We need to, at this moment of a profound historical rupture in human affairs, we need to have a great clarity and vision and hunger for understanding historical turning points, because our historical assessment of the origins of today's crisis shape directly our assessment of what's causing it. And that any assessment, whether you say it's technology, it's culture, it's population, it's class, it's capital, any assessment leads back to a historical interpretation, whether you want it to or not. And so these assessments are, these historical assessments are really very fundamental, not only to understanding the origins, but to understanding our evaluation of the present crisis and the politics necessary for it. So the capitalocene is not a theory of everything, and it does not even argue with the more geologically specific forms of the Anthropocene argument. For instance, as we will see, the great geographers Lewis and Maslin have advanced what they call the Orbis spike or global spike to identify the low point in carbon dioxide concentrations that followed the New World genocides in the 16th century. We're going to come back to that because that was a moment of the first capital-ogenic climate crisis. That is, capital-ogenic made by capital, not anthropogenic made by all humans, which is really an insult upon injury to all of those peoples exterminated in the interests of cheap nature and turning life into profit-making opportunities. So the capitalocene is not a theory of everything. It is an argument about the origins of planetary crisis. And we'll keep moving back to that. There are, for those of you who are familiar, two rival capitalocenes. One is associated with the fossil capital argument and with Andreas Malm, who says it starts in England with coal and steam power and the English working class in the early 19th century. And I don't disagree that that was a turning point. that was indeed a turning point. It is neither an adequate interpretation of that turning point, as we will see, because what happened in England was in fact dependent on the cotton plantation revolution in the American South at that moment. But it was not the origins of planetary crisis. And this matters quite a bit. Whether we start in 1492 or 1830 makes all the difference in the world to our view of politics. Do we see the problem of fossil capital as essentially one of wage labor and a technical facility around the steam engine and a certain deployment of fossil fuel energy? Or do we understand all of those moments within wider relations of power, profit, and life? So obviously, if one begins the story of planetary crisis, as I have done over the past 20 years, by looking at the prodigious, productive, military, technological, economic, and yes, environment-making revolutions of this era in the 16th and 17th centuries, we have a very, very different view of planetary crisis. And I will try to unpack the outlines of that. But essentially, it says that the climate class divide, climate patriarchy, and climate apartheid are not the results of today's climate crisis, but they are the causes of today's climate crisis. This trinity of the climate class divide, climate apartheid, and climate patriarchy forms in what I will call, after Ladary, the great climate historian, the long, cold 17th century. So looking at capitalism not merely as an economic system, not merely as a social system, but a world ecology of power, profit, and life, of capital, class, and climate, foregrounds a series of intimate connections between world domination, like racism and sexism, world nature, webs of life that include humans, and world accumulation. And this point of view and this historical interpretation highlights this capitalogenic trinity that I've been talking about of the climate class divide, apartheid, and patriarchy, and understands that these relations of domination and accumulation are central to the endless accumulation of capital, which compels the endless exhaustion of the underlying sources of wealth, the soil and the worker, to quote Marx, of course, metaphorically speaking. And let's remind ourselves that for Marx insists repeatedly, labor itself is a natural force. Labor itself is a specifically harnessed natural force. Labor transforms itself as a part of nature in relation to the rest of nature. So this link between class power, between proletarianization and bourgeoisification or bourgeois class formation, and the transformations and degradations of the earth and the people who live on it is a fundamental moment to the world ecology conversation. And it leads us to different politics, as you can see. As I said in Web of Life, if you shut down a coal plant because you believe the coal plant or the gasoline guzzling SUV is driving the planetary crisis, then you can slow it for a moment. So if you blow up a pipeline, you can do it for a day. If you shut down the relations that make possible pipelines, you can stop it for good. So what kind of crisis are we in the midst of? And I'm going to get in just a moment to sustainability as an imaginary of dealing with this crisis that is at base fundamentally hopeless and indeed fundamentally joined to imperial and class projects from its origins in the late 60s and early 1970s. So for sustainability, the problem is man versus nature. It is a matter of anthropogenic, made by humanity, climate change. An alternative would be to look at assemblages, dialectics of capital, class, empire, and climate, a matter of capitalogenic climate change. Remember, one of the key roles of bourgeois ideology, of any ideology, is to disallow certain language and to make certain kinds of language, like talking about capital, like talking about class, essentially forbidden or irrational or irrelevant. So we are dealing simultaneously with a web of life problem in its physicality and a problem of civilization and nature as ideological constructs practically implicated in colonialism, class formation, genocide, and ecocide from the very beginning. And it's this kind of approach that allows us to look over the long run of capitalist developments from 1492 to the present and ask, well, what kind of crisis is this? And this came out of decades of people asking me, well, what's the difference with the moment of the 1970s when everyone said the limits to growth had been reached or would soon be reached? And the problem with that conception was, well, there are many problems, but the core conception was to take the question of limits outside of history and to reduce it essentially to a carrying capacity argument. Now, I'm not saying we can't use carrying capacities within certain highly targeted analytical arguments, but we all know what we're talking about, this neo-Malthusian relatively fixed limits to growth model that conceptualized limits outside of the relations of power and production and profit and life in the modern world. So is this today a developmental crisis, one that can be resolved through new rounds of frontier expansion, of imperialism, of cheap labor, energy, food, raw materials? Or is it an epical crisis of capitalism as a world ecology? This is crucial. Now, I want to make a contrast here, so the illustrations are here to sort of reinforce this contrast, and then we want to create a unity out of the diversity. We all know there is a geological or geophysical tipping point that is now in play that is irreversible. Earth system scientists call this a state shift. So abrupt, irreversible, fundamental. That's what we're seeing in the biosphere, not only with the climate system, but especially. CO2 levels reaching their highest in 800,000 years, but we are also in the midst of a geohistorical tipping point. This is, again, an illustration. It's of no concern to me whether someone accepts a hard or soft theory of the falling rate of profit. But on one question, today, neoclassical and Marxist economists are agreed. There is a moment of secular or long-term stagnation in the capitalist world ecology, and that would be the low point of this long-run tendential decline in the world rate of profit. This is from the great political economist Maito and Michael Roberts' reconstructions of it. There are these geohistorical tipping points. The long-term stagnation in capitalist agricultural productivity, which I've written extensively about. Climate change is already part of this story, inducing yield suppression of the four major cereal crops: maize, rice, soybeans, and wheat. So these are geohistorical tipping points that are related to, in significant ways, the geological tipping point. In the case of agriculture, which is one of the greatest contributors of greenhouse gases, we are seeing a moment where the climate change is producing a stagnation in capitalist agriculture, and capitalist agriculture is producing an acceleration of the climate change itself. So this is a great example of the world ecology argument. The webs of life are not only products of human organization, like capitalism, like financial organizations, but they're also producers. Nature, in other words, is not only a product, but also a producer of historical change. So in the present moment, we have these two major moments of crisis formation: a singular crisis with distinct moments that are reinforcing each other, as I've just suggested. A crisis of life making. We see this in the biodiversity crisis. We see it in the climate crisis. We see it in a human biological reproductive crisis, where the medical researcher Shona Swan has demonstrated that in the advanced capitalist nations of the world, the median sperm count for an adult man by 2045 will be 0. Of course, it affects women as well in dramatic ways, but I just want us to keep in mind that there is a crisis of life making that is intimately connected with a deepening crisis of profit making. In other words, as cheap nature is progressively exhausted, and by the way, that exhaustion includes class struggles and social movements from below. As cheap nature is progressively exhausted, it becomes more and more difficult for capitalists to find a home for their surplus capital. That's why 13 trillion with a T, $trillion of surplus capital are sitting in government securities around the world, returning a negative rate of return. So we want to keep this in mind. Now, where does sustainability fit in there? Oftentimes we frame this question as capitalism versus sustainability, and there are very good reasons for why we do that. I want to suggest that sustainability is not an innocent description of a project to make planet Earth a good and just home for humans and the rest of nature, and that its roots lie deep in American Cold War politics and in its imperial reconstruction of the world after World War II in an era of decolonization. So sustainability politics, of course, before the letter, took shape in this period between 1963 and 1975, and that it was never really about sustainability. It was from the beginning what James Ferguson, in a very different context about developmentalist projects in Lesotho in Southern Africa, calls an anti-politics machine. Why is that? Because sustainability, like developmentalism, transforms political questions of democracy and justice into technical, scientific, and demographic policy prescriptions that essentially promote rule by experts, but always in the interest of creating profit-making opportunities. So sustainability grew directly out of a number of different aspects of the post World War II era, but two were really crucial. One was the Green Revolution, which was waged specifically as a Cold War project to prevent Nehru and a kind of Indian nationalism from adopting elements of the Red Agricultural Revolution in China, which had been extraordinarily successful. And so the Green Revolution was actively promoted by American policymakers as a technical fix to the so-called natural problem of so-called overpopulation. We'll return to that in a moment. But let's remember, India was one of the battlegrounds of the Cold War. And many of the leading lights of environmentalism had crucial experiences in India in the 1960s, including Lester Brown of World Watch, including Paul Ehrlich, Garrett Hardin, and the future executive director of the Sierra Club, the major US environmentalist organization. But it also grew, the Sustainability Earth System project also grew out of the computing network revolution pioneered by Jay Forrester at MIT's Sloan School of Management in the 1950s and 1960s. If you've never heard of Jay Forrester, he is the most important figure in the history of sustainability that you've never heard of. It was Jay Forrester's models who were used by Richard and Donella Meadows to make the limits to growth. And so this was a computing network revolution that grew directly and explicitly out of a project to secure the North American homeland in the event of an American first strike attack on the Soviet Union. And in the event that any of the Soviet bombers escaped, they could be stopped by a multi-site, real-time communications computing network. It was out of this project that the basic computer, the basic computer code, the first computer coding language was developed. So this is very crucial to understand this lineage here. We need to ask why sustainability and the global environmental imaginary in this period. What was happening in this period? Now, when you read accounts of this, everyone will tell you about environmental problems, an oil spill in Santa Barbara. Outside of, next to Cleveland, the river, the Cuyahoga, catches fire. There were a number of other sort of like noteworthy, newsworthy environmental problems that were highlighted, but there was nothing that approached an environmental crisis. Only in the hands of Paul Ehrlich, who we'll turn to in just a moment, did we find an argument for environmental crisis, which said there were too many people. But there was a very real problem going on from the standpoint of the North Atlantic ruling classes. And this was an unprecedented wave of working class and peasant revolt across the world, of anti-colonial revolt across the world, including in the heartland of the imperial heartland of the United States. So we want to keep that in mind, that sustainability begins to take shape in this period of unprecedented social revolt from below. And by the way, this was not the first time. When Malthus is writing the first essay on population in 1798, he is writing at a moment of extraordinary class revolt. Not only the radical turn of the Jacobins in France in the early 1790s, but also much of England had become essentially ungovernable as English peasants and workers revolted against high food prices, seized grain shipments, and essentially asserted a moral economy against capitalist political economy. That was the class context of Malthus's argument 2 centuries earlier. So what was happening in the United States? Well, a very dangerous situation from the standpoint of big industrial capital. The rate of profit had been falling since 1966. The war in Vietnam had created an inflationary moment that was destabilizing, and workers were walking out in unprecedented numbers, not since the, you can see for a moment there in the early 1950s, but really not since the Great Depression and the trade union mobilizations of the 1930s had there been such an extraordinary moment of working class revolt. So enter Richard Nixon, never somebody to pass up an ideological or political opportunity. Richard Nixon was completely shameless. He was completely an opportunist. And so in his second State of the Union address, his annual presidential address in January 1970, he gives this speech in which he says, amongst other things, restoring nature to its natural state is a cause beyond party and beyond factions. By the way, this is at the moment where helicopters like this one, the famous Huey attack helicopters, were dropping Agent Orange and Agent Blue on Vietnam's forests, an act for which the Vietnamese continue to pay to this day in countless birth defects and the poisoning of their environments. So this is very important. This moment is very important. Because remember, he's saying, why can't we all just get along? We can all surely agree over the question of the environment. The environment basically meant a good, clean environment for professional white-collar workers as a kind of social base to which he was appealing. And later he found that he could pursue a different politics with a different demographic base. But this last point is very, very crucial. So we're going to keep this context in mind. Now, 2 years earlier, Paul and Ann Ehrlich had published The Population Bomb. It was published by the Sierra Club at the behest of David Brower, its longtime executive director. And this is a fundamental moment in the formation of an environmental imaginary. There was no more highly visible environmental scholar in the 1970s in the Anglo-American world than Paul Ehrlich. He was on the Johnny Carson show, the famous late night show that virtually everyone in America watched if they could stay up until 11:30 at night. Paul Ehrlich was hugely influential, and his argument, as you can imagine, was too many people, which I paraphrase as that always meant too many brown people. And you can get a sense of this. I'm just going to read a snippet of this. This is at the opening of The Population Bomb in 1968, where he's recalling his visit to Delhi in 1965 as just dirty, filthy people visiting, arguing, screaming, washing, urinating. There were animals, there were fleas. He says, ever since that night, you can see at the very bottom, I've known the feel of overpopulation. He doesn't see the feel of the British Empire, which had imposed no fewer than 3 major famines over the previous 70 years, from the 1890s onward, beginning with what Mike Davis calls the late Victorian Holocausts. And this and culminating with the 1943 Bengal famine, to which we'll return momentarily, in which Prime Minister Winston Churchill allows 3 million people to starve to death. He doesn't see empire. He doesn't see class. He doesn't see the long history of imperialist deindustrialization and impoverishment of India. He knows the feel of overpopulation, even though, you guessed it, at the same time, London had 3 times as many people. Enter Winston Churchill. This is a direct quote. Even Churchill's India Home Office director during World War II said, I see essentially no difference between Churchill and Hitler's racial attitudes. This is what he says in the midst of the Great Bengal Famine in 1943, when the Australian and Canadian governments said, we have grain supplies on the docks of Perth and Vancouver ready to send to Bengal. He said, no worry, they breed like rabbits. This is what Ehrlich is playing into. And what Ehrlich is also playing into, this populationist, catastrophist imaginary, this man versus nature metaphor, it plays in directly to this old radical question of, well, why is it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism? Well, in part, sustainability and the man versus nature thinking. Now, this poster here, this cartoon here on the left is not accidental. And I'm going to touch on this for a moment. It was the iconic poster for the first Earth Day in April 1970. And next to it, I put the famous quote, famous passage from Malthus's first essay about nature's mighty feast, that we can't just let everyone come to the table because nature is a place of scarcity, and that we have to honor nature's laws in order to ensure that we can survive. Of course, this is a variation of lifeboat ethics and spaceship ethics, as we'll see. So as I tell my students, beware in environmental discussions. If somebody is talking in a boat metaphor or a naval metaphor, you know that you're in trouble, because the voyage of discovery, if to stick with the metaphor, is towards some kind of blood and soil eco-fascism. You end up like James Lovelock of the Gaia hypothesis, saying we must build up the British Navy in order to keep out the African migrants. That's not really a paraphrase. So we want to keep this history and this history of ideas in our place. But another reason is because in the sustainability man versus nature imaginary, we have been given a narrative in which there is no such thing as a climate class revolt. And one of the things that we need to install at the forefront of our environmental justice thinking is this: unfavorable climate shifts for class societies are moments of fundamental social instability, of the disruption of politics and business as usual. So here we can see three great moments of popular revolt and climate change over the past 2,000 years. One is from the Grand Jacquerie in France in 1357. The second, to which we'll return later, is a representation of the Haitian Revolution in 1791. And then finally, the Goths crossing the Danube in 376. They confront the Roman legions at Adrianople in 378 and deliver the worst military defeat to Rome since Hannibal at Cannae in the midst of the Second Punic War in the 3rd century BC. By the way, that was not just a military conflict. It was also a general strike at which the Gothic working class, the miners especially, joined the Gothic migration into Rome, and sort of combined elements of a general strike with a kind of popular insurgency. So we want to keep this in mind, that unfavorable climate shifts are bad for ruling classes. To believe that capitalism will continue in something like its present form in the midst of the most dramatic climate shift that humanity has seen since the dawn of the Holocene, well, that's to engage in a kind of magical thinking. And magical thinking has been at the heart of the sustainability project from the very beginning. What Earth Day and everything that came after did was to enforce the idea that humans, that individuals, were in aggregate responsible for something called environmental crisis. And what it did was to transform a very elite bourgeois kind of concern around bourgeois naturalism into a mass movement of white-collar professional workers. And that's very important. That's sometimes called the professional managerial class, but that's very important because it involved an anti-working class politics from the very beginning. And we can see this in many different countries, especially the richest countries, the utter failure of working class and environmentalist politics to find common ground in this era. But there's more to the story than just that. That 1 week after the first Earth Day in 1970, President Nixon invaded Cambodia. That would eventually set the stage for the ascendance of Pol Pot and the murderous rampages that followed. Every major university in the United States was in open revolt. National Guards were mobilized over 40 times. We know this in our history of the 60s because of the unprovoked attack by the US military on unarmed students, one at Kent State, that's on the left, and then at Jackson State, a historically Black college in Mississippi. If you're wondering why we have pictures of a window, it's because the National Guards shot the Black students sleeping in their dorms. Of course, this is business as usual under American apartheid class rule. But keep this in mind. Of course, this was also the moment of napalm bombing and Nixon's horrific bombing campaign everywhere. Napalm in the South, napalm in the North, and horrific bombing of industrial centers in the North as well. Indeed, Nixon contemplated using nuclear weapons in order to bring the war to a close. So we have met the enemy and he is us. Well, not for so-called Napalm Girl, not for millions of Vietnamese. No major national environmentalist movement that had been involved with the Earth Day organizing mobilized against the war. None would for the next 3 decades, and I haven't done my proper homework to see the mobilization of big environmentalist groups against the forever war, the endless occupations, endless wars in the Middle East, for instance. But I haven't seen anything to suggest that they have. So this is very important that the carrying water or running ideological cover for American imperialism has been fundamental to the global environmental imaginary. So why is it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism? Well, this is how consent is manufactured, as Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman pointed out decades ago, as Michael Parenti pointed out decades ago, that there is an ideological factory that is the media industrial complex owned by fewer and fewer corporations. Now 6 corporations own well more than half of the world's media, and we are getting the message again and again and again. Well, we are destroying the earth. We humans did it. Now there's a one line is to say we are destroying the earth. One line is quite properly to highlight the racism and sexism that's involved in this process. Unfortunately, often those approaches are engaged in a kind of class denialism that make their criticisms entirely consonant with neoliberal ideology. But at the heart is the ideological function of sustainability and the ways in which scientists articulate the problem. They articulate the problem as humans versus nature. If you think in those terms, which, by the way, were the terms of European empires as they went out and conquered and subordinated the rest of the planet, as we'll see, this dynamic of civilization and savagery, which is just updated in present day terms as society and nature, humanity and nature. If you look at it from that point of view, you will indeed be hopeless because it is essentially a human nature argument. Humans will be humans, just like snakes will be snakes and dogs will be dogs. And so it fuels, as Jason Box discovered a while back, it fuels a hopelessness that's nevertheless socially unacceptable. To say we're fucked is one thing, but we have to look at the ideological worldview in which that hopelessness takes place. On the other side of this is a kind of naive techno-scientific fantasy that sort of imagine an updated 1960s Star Trek world in which, yes, there are limits, but science and technology can fix all those limits by moving on to new frontiers. So today, this is Elon Musk. Let's go to Mars. Personally, I hope he does. So we always need to ask, of course, which humans do it. And yes, this is a question of wealth inequality. More fundamentally, it's a question of an uneven balance of class power, to say the least. And so when we look at these dynamics, where we look at the names and locations of the corporations responsible for the overwhelming majority of greenhouse gas emissions, we need to understand this as more than corporations. We need to understand this as a system of capital accumulation that is at every turn a system of political power. So this is hugely important to keep in mind as we walk through. This is, as good as anything, a representation of imperial power over the past almost 2 centuries now. And let's keep in mind that much of China's output was directly financed by Euro, American, and Japanese foreign capital. That's begun to change over recent years. But we have this picture in mind that's very important. And so this really tells us something about sustainability and its origins in Spaceship Earth. Now, in full disclosure, the progenitor of the concept, Buckminster Fuller, was an anti-Malthusian, and his phrasing, his idea got snapped up and used in very different ways. And Fuller wanted to design his way to a better world. And in fact, he came up with a number of ingenious designs, precisely designs of the kind that are not financed in today's late stage capitalist scene. So Spaceship Earth became a very, very powerful trope. And when we talk about the Anthropocene today, the Anthropocene's language of life support systems, its exclusion of relations of class power, class struggle, capital accumulation, it all goes back to Spaceship Earth. The Anthropocene is Spaceship Earth for neoliberal times. This screenshot from the lower left is the title page of the semi-official documentary for the 1972 Stockholm Environment Conference. Indeed, Ehrlich's original title was going to be Our Spaceship is Bursting, and later he wrote, The Earth is a spacecraft with a limited carrying capacity. So this is his mantra again and again and again, that population and scarcity are mathematical problems. They're not problems of socio-ecological relations. And that's just demonstrably false historically. So we had a lot of sort of Star Trek, the original series, and of space techno-communism, in which, we're all crew, we're all getting along, there's no conflicts. And you can imagine the response to this from both working class people across the world and also countries across the global South. That this was, they understood these arguments as essentially arguments for a green austerity that would limit their own possibilities and allow for the imperialist and other rich countries to grow fat. So the metaphors matter. Remember that ideology works by installing phrases that help us think systemically, and by making anti-systemic concepts appear unreasonable and irrational. And so this gets us to a history that we need to look at. Of course, for sustainability and Spaceship Earth, there is no history. It's an attempt to scrub the decks clean of any historical sensibility as well. But if we can look at the origins of a problem, we can begin to understand its development and the politics that are called for in the present moment. And to do that, we need to go back to the rise of capitalism. It's important to remember that the rise of capitalism occurs under extremely unfavorable climatological circumstances. This is what historians call the Little Ice Age, roughly between 1300 and 1850. Now, there's no need to take in all of this at the moment. We're going to come back to it. But essentially, what we're looking at are 2 proxies for climate history in the Northern Hemisphere over the past 2 millennia. At the top are the fluctuations in solar intensity, the solar minima and solar maxima. At the bottom are a sequence of a chart of volcanism, of volcanic activity. We don't like to admit it as scholars in the humanities, but volcanic activity has shaped a whole lot of human history. But in any event, what we can see here is that during moments of climate downturn, one sees either an epochal crisis, like in the 14th century with the crisis of feudalism, or a developmental crisis. So an example of a developmental crisis, as we will see momentarily, is in the 17th century, the long, cold 17th century, associated with the Maunder minimum you can see there towards the right-hand side of the graph. So basically what we want to have in mind is that there is a way in which climate is entangled with all the major relations of power, of production, of accumulation in the widest range of civilizations. It's not that climate determines. Climate does not determine, but climate is in everything. And the metaphor that I like to use is that when the climate becomes especially unfavorable, it's like if you have a sweater with a loose thread and you start pulling on the thread and then everything comes unraveled. It's like that. The climate is not everything, but it's impossible to explain anything world historically without climate in the mix. So we need to ask, why was it that capitalism was able to develop and thrive in an era of very unfavorable climate, indeed under climate conditions that resembled those of the crisis of feudal Europe in the 14th century and that resembled those of Western Rome in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries? So the short answer is that the technologies and including the economic and financial technologies of the era under conditions of feudal ruling classes, extraordinary defeat. Feudalism was defeated as a class system in the 14th and 15th century, that all of this together allowed and pushed out a new system of frontier making, which brought together systems of domination and labor mobilization and capital accumulation with armed military might. So this is a story, this is a very stylized painting of the fall of Malaga. It's a story that Patel and I narrate in Seven Cheap Things. The title in German is great, it's Devaluation. And basically we show how at the fall of Malaga, when the Spaniards conquered it, they sold every single one of its inhabitants, Muslim and Jewish, into slavery. Columbus was present at the fall of Malaga. And this dialectic or weave of dialectics of credit, conquest, and coerced labor would, of course, shape planetary history ever since. Nowhere more spectacularly than in the creation of a capitalist Pangea, bringing back together the Pangea geologically after 175 million years. What this meant was that potentially the work and energy of two continents was now at the disposal of the conquerors, who were also indebted, who needed labor to work the plantations, to work the mines, to work the workshops, and they needed to satisfy their creditors. Philip II in Spain famously begins his reign by declaring bankruptcy and continues to do so across his reign because he is in the process of converting tax money and plunder into capital that can be used to fight his wars, his endless wars. And above all, what the Colombian capitalist invasion needed to do was to secure labor. There's an older argument that says microbes killed off everyone in the Americas. This has now been demonstrated fairly conclusively to be false. Yes, microbes would have killed a share of indigenous populations, perhaps 25%, perhaps 35%, not 95%. And why did 95% of the indigenous population die? Because the conquerors were engaged in a cheap labor slaving cycle. So what you can see here, if you can make it out, is that the tan or beige segments of this map are the parts of the Americas that were most struck by epidemic disease. And they were also the flashpoints of early proletarianization, enslavement, and cheap labor. So in other words, commodity production, proletarianization, conquest goes along with the great dying. And you can see the catastrophic effects here. Now, this would shape the rest of our capitalism's history in the most powerful way. The destruction of indigenous peoples led to a massive carbon drawdown as forests grew back, absorbed more carbon, as soils were undisturbed by agriculture, absorbing more carbon. And this reinforced the most severe moment of the Little Ice Age, this long, cold 17th century. So this was capitalism's first climate crisis. It wasn't generated by the Orbis spike. It was a combination of a change in the Gulf Stream, of volcanic activity, of changes in solar intensity, but also of changes in the carbon concentration in the atmosphere. Hugely important. Why so important? Because this period of 1550 to 1700 was the era when everything decisive about capitalism really forms, crystallizes, and consolidates. In other words, this is the origins of climate apartheid, patriarchy, and the climate class divide. And I'm going to whip through this and we can come back to this. I'm going to show you a lot of pictures just to give you a sense of the severity. This is the severity of winters in Europe precisely at the moment of the Orbis spike. This was also, I mentioned the unfavorable climate shifts are bad for politics as usual. Well, this was it. The era of the 17th century was an era of endless war and endemic class warfare. It was also a moment, as I'll try to show, of the climate fix, of how to fix the problems of the worst of the Little Ice Age. Well, part of that was to drive as intensively as possible towards a slaving regime. And you can see the relative weights of the slave trade relative to economic growth conventionally measured. Now, of course, African slaving follows directly on the heels of the New World Genocide. The New World Genocides induced by a slaving project then exhausts, that's a polite way of saying killed off all the indigenous peoples, which then leaves planters and mine owners and everyone else in a position of like, where do we get the labor? Well, you can plug into sub-Saharan Africa. There's a complex story of how Africa fits in, how internal African politics fits into the story, but suffice it to say, the slaving frontier was opened on a massive scale. That this is the planetary logic of eco-genocide. But this was also the moment of an audacious gendered counter-revolution in early modern Europe, that is between 1550 and 1700. Think witch hunts, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. This is the story that Silvia Federici has told so well. This was a story of the great domestication in precisely this moment of capitalist crisis in the 17th century. So what was the solution? The riddle is that capitalism survives when the same climatological conditions had essentially unraveled feudal power in this period. Well, how did capitalism survive? Well, it drove very hard and very fast towards the tropical and subtropical worlds. Again, open revolt across Europe, endless war across Europe, but also the most audacious phase of colonial expansion until the Great Scramble for Africa about 2 centuries later. So we want to keep this frontier dynamic in mind because so often in sustainability discussions, one forgets that capitalism survives, it feasts of the lifeblood of the frontier, of women, nature, and colonies, in the words of Maria Mies. Now, so we might ask, given all this, why is Spaceship Earth the metaphor for planetary life? Why isn't Slaveship Earth the metaphor instead? And here, I just want to share a first-person account of the middle passage, because when I read it, it struck me as so similar to what Paul Ehrlich said. If you remember that visit to India where he says it was dirty and there were fleas and everyone was crammed in together. And I thought, this reminds me a lot of Equiano's autobiography. And I tried to imagine the absurdity of Paul Ehrlich visiting a slave ship and saying, the problem is overpopulation. These people are crammed in there too tightly together. Look at how they're sleeping. This is horrible. And so I think that we want to keep that absurd comparison in our mind, because at the one level it is absurd, and at another it's a totally reasonable critique to make. So we want to imagine that this imaginary of man versus nature really begins to form during this period of the formation of slave ship Earth, of climate apartheid, and the climate class divide. And it's in this era that we get Descartes famously making the distinction between thinking things and extended things. Well, anyone who's ever studied management or the history of capitalist labor knows that that's about as perfect a broad conceptual description of management and work as you can imagine. And that was indeed the management on slave plantations, where modern managerial philosophy really took shape. So this is a Cartesian moment that's also a Columbian moment after Columbus, that's also the formation of slave ship Earth. Now, what were the slave ships producing? They were producing cheap work. And we want to keep that in mind when we say plantation, when we say climate apartheid, we do not mean a clash of civilizations where bad white people are doing terrible things. That may or may not be true, certainly was true often enough on the slave ships, but this is a class dynamic of capital accumulation with devastating effects on the web of life, including human beings. So slave ship Earth is actually a much more hopeful metaphor than spaceship Earth and the Anthropocene and Jason Box, the climate scientist, saying, well, we're fucked. Well, slave ship Earth was a place of dynamic class struggle and social revolt. 500 recorded slave revolts, probably 5 times as many. But slave ship Earth culminates in the first semi-proletarian revolution, the Haitian Revolution in 1791. It is at this moment of climate change, the last great cold snap of the Ice Age, Little Ice Age, in which Malthus is writing. Malthus is writing directly in response to the Haitian and French revolutions, the Irish Revolt, English agrarian revolts, and much beyond. So this link between the late 18th century slave ship Earth, the climate, the last great climate cold snap of the Little Ice Age, the so-called Dalton minimum, and Malthusian ideology. We have to be able to put all of this together. And to remember Malthus's major contribution, which I foregrounded by saying this about Ehrlich, that he took the problem of population outside of history. That's the neo-Malthusian imaginary. It may or may not have to do with population as such. So all of this is important because the conventional story, and here we'll begin to draw this to a close so we can have a rollicking discussion, but all of this goes to a really basic point that I can no more than gesture towards, which is that climate apartheid was part of the plantation revolution, which was the pivot of modernity. It was the origins of climate crisis. It was out of the plantation revolution that not only is capitalism saved as a geopolitical, political, economic entity, but that provides the necessary capital formation and conditions for the Industrial Revolution. But before it could do that, there had to be a wave of dispossessions in the American South to clear the ground literally for the chief raw material of the Industrial Revolution, which was not, I repeat, not coal. And the key machine of the Industrial Revolution was not, I repeat, not the steam engine. It was the cotton gin and it was coal. It was the cotton gin rather and cotton. See, I'm even caught up in a slip of the tongue there. This is the dispossessions necessary to make the second slavery go. Here we see slave markets, the cotton gin. The cotton gin magnified labor productivity, even if you're a strict Marxist, which some of these people around the fossil capital thesis say they are. Even if you're a strict Marxist, you have to look at the 50-fold increase in labor productivity made possible by the cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney there on the cotton gin pictured on the right. They're invented in 1793. So we just want to have a sense that in this moment, climate apartheid and also climate patriarchy, but I'm focusing on the apartheid moment, was itself a decisive ideological lever of capital accumulation and class exploitation that made possible the so-called Industrial Revolution. All right, so all of this brings together a lot, I realize. So hopefully we can unpack some of the nuances here. So this means moving in our climate imaginary and our sustainability imaginary from man versus nature to climate class configurations. Those are shorthands. If you like other phrases, go ahead and use that, but something that targets the specific socio-ecological relations. It's out of this area, climate class divide, climate patriarchy, climate apartheid, and putting all of the web of life to work for capital, that we get this trinity of the proletariat, the femitariat, the biotariat. So in other words, conditions of work, unpaid work, socially necessary, unpaid work that makes possible the apparatus of class exploitation. This provides a different point of entry into a common ground for a working class environmentalist politics. So I would say against sustainability, but for planetary justice, and to remember Chico Mendes, the great Brazilian rubber tapper, before he was executed by the landlords. We need to immunize ourselves and to against the environmentalism of the rich. Al Gore environmentalism. Let's solve the world's climate crisis by starting a hedge fund. That's Al Gore's politics. And that, unfortunately, is a very, very common outlook among mainstream environmentalists. I know that we're running close on time here. So I'm just going to remind people that the class argument from Marx was always a historical, geographical web of life argument. People forget this all the time. The key text, of course, is the German ideology. And he's putting these two moments together. For Marx, everything is connected, and we can argue about how they're connected. But he says, hey, we have to deal with climate history and the transformations of natural conditions that are fundamental to the formation of classes. For world ecology, we need to, the extension or elaboration of that Marxist insight is to say, yes, cheap nature is economic. It's about the conditions of capital accumulation. Yes, cheap nature is about devaluation. It is geocultural. It is about the devaluation of the lives and labors of women, nature, and colonies. And it's also about political power and carrying forth the civilizing project, later called the developmentalist project, over long centuries of development. So all the way from the Spaniards and the Christianizing projects of that era to President Truman and the developmentalist project of the United States after World War II. And of course, finally, that at every turn, capitalism depends on frontiers of cheap nature that cannot simply be reproduced or conjured in a kind of world historical alchemy. Here, there's just a few pictures as we wind this up to understand capitalism booms when there's a small amount of capital and very, very large opportunities for appropriating by extra economic means the work of the biotariat and femitariat. And that every great wave of capital accumulation, every new industrialization requires a new imperialism to move to new frontiers to find the four cheaps of labor, food, energy, and raw materials. The climate crisis today not only brings that process to an end, but it implodes the cheap nature model. So now we can just reflect as we close up in the last minute, which is that these great moments of unfavorable climate shift have been moments of political and economic crisis, moments of fundamental transformations of business and politics as usual. And even when there is a developmental crisis, as in the 17th century, there is, or in the late 18th century and early 19th century, the age of revolutions, there is a fundamental remaking of capitalism's structures of accumulation and power. So that's why this distinction of a developmental crisis and an epochal crisis is so, so important. Our politics will be completely different if we believe it is the first and not the second, or the second and not the first. And we need to look for the possibilities, not just of asserting common ground in the abstract, but of understanding how structures of domination like racism and sexism and so forth are political expressions of capital's drive towards super exploited labor to extract as much paid and unpaid labor as possible at every turn. So at the end of the Holocene, we need to pose some very, very difficult questions and make some very difficult and painful observations. One is the bankruptcy of sustainability politics. And I'm not sure that it's failed. Maybe it's succeeded in doing exactly what it was intended to do, even against the good intentions of many practitioners. But it's also been clearly a moment at which ruling classes around the world have been fined to allow unprecedented climate devastations. That will surely continue. There will be 100 Hurricane Marias in such as the one that struck Puerto Rico. You can pick others that struck Bangladesh, or Hurricane Harvey in Houston a few years ago. But we also have to confront a very, very unsettling point that there will be no easy, simple, linear, or non-violent transition to whatever you want to think about sustainability or sustainable justice or a steady state economy. The strategy of ruling classes across the 20th century in terms of confronting zero-sum situations, that is, either they win and you lose, or you win and they lose, that kind of mentality has been codified in imperialist practices. So that is the mentality of we had to destroy the village in order to save it. This is, of course, the history of Vietnam, of the Vietnam War. This is a photograph of Stalingrad in 1943. That scorched earth has been the order of the day to challengers, to those who would dare challenge imperial business as usual. So I would say we need to look towards a revolutionary climate politics, a revolutionary planetary justice that foregrounds reconstruction. Reconstruction has multiple meanings, one of which comes out of the American experience after the Civil War. And this was a moment at which the radical Republicans, yes, that's what they were called, installed a military dictatorship in the South in order to promote multiracial democracy. So they disenfranchised the old plantation aristocracy and opened up the conditions for a multiracial democracy in which African Americans were elected to Congress, to the Senate, to state legislatures. It was a brief moment of possibility and tremendous ferment. And so that was a moment at which the old class system was, at least for a moment, thoroughly liquidated and reconstructed in an emancipatory way. There are other examples that we can look at across the past century, which involve the experiences of reconstruction after great wars suffered by imperialist attacks. So we need to take seriously, yes, indeed, the history of very, very poor countries like the Soviet Union and China and Cuba at reconstructing their countries after being essentially razed to the ground. Now, I'm not saying to do this with illusions. I'm also saying we don't do this with the illusions that anti-communism makes everything that happened a bad thing. So we should look at how all of these moments are fitting together to pursue a radical decommodification strategy, a radical social reproduction strategy, including for the productive, reproductive justice of planetary life, and to look for the possibilities that come out of that. So remember, we are in a moment of political possibility. The climate crisis is a moment of unprecedented political possibility, of the unprecedented weakness, despite all appearances to the contrary, of the world's ruling classes. Thank you.